Chapter 3 on Socrates' two favorite questions. Question number 1, what exactly do you mean? Herrick uses the Euthyphro, Platonic dialogue of a conversation between Socrates and Euthyphro, who is prosecuting his own father for unintentionally but negligently killing his servant. Socrates says, why? Why are you going through this with this prosecution? It's your own dad. And Euthyphro says, because it's the pious thing to do, meaning the morally correct thing to do. Socrates probes for a clearer definition of piety, and he's seeking a rational criterion on which to base other moral judgments on in the future, and also to evaluate this for Euthyphro's sake and for his sake. And what he encounters is vagueness, ambiguity, circular definitions. And so Herrick uses this as an example to help us understand the importance of using precise terms and clear definitions. Two things he says early in the chapter is to avoid vagueness and ambiguity. Vague means it's unclear whether the term applies or not. It's just not precise enough. So, for example, if you say a person is tall, what constitutes being tall would vary from situation to situation, from location to location. If you're just talking about an everyday person, if they're 6 foot tall, does that mean they're actually tall or are they just in between? If they're 7 foot tall, they would be tall almost anywhere. But what if they're 5'8" in China? Understand that Chinese are on average a little bit shorter than most average Americans. What if we're talking about an NBA player? What would constitute tall amongst NBA players? It's just vague to say the person is tall. Similarly, if you say that they're rich, there are billionaires that are clearly rich, but Herrick uses the example of, say, a professor that makes $100,000 a year and his or her mortgage is paid off. So they don't have that biggest income expense for their mortgage. Would they be considered rich? It seems a bit of a stretch to call them rich. We might say that they're financially independent, perhaps. But in any case, it's a vague term. And so you need to be a little bit more precise if you're going to engage in anything important or an important discussion anyway. Ambiguity is similar to vagueness, except that the phrase or the term or the sentence can be interpreted more than one way reasonably. For example, Pastor Lee married my sister. Does this mean that Pastor Lee is now your brother-in-law, or does it simply mean that Pastor Lee officiated your sister's wedding? Matt made a major change when he was a sophomore. Does this mean Matt decided to get married, or does it mean that Matt, when he was a sophomore, decided to switch his college majors from pre-med and biology to philosophy, which is what's actually true, but just based on that sentence, it's ambiguous what the intended meaning is. Now, Herrick says on page 59, reasoning with vague or ambiguous words can be like trying to play catch with puffs of smoke. Hard to get a firm hold on anything, and hard to tell whether the point they're trying to make is true or in correspondence with reality. So that's why it's so important to be precise. And remember, as philosophers, we're like scientists, and so we want to use very precise instruments, very precise tools, because the only primary tool we have is our thinker. And so if we're dealing with very vague terminology, vague definitions, we're not going to make any progress, just like if a scientist had a crummy microscope or a crummy telescope or whatever, crummy, not very sensitive or precise tool measurement instruments. We need to be precise with our terms. What we want are actually Goldilocks definitions. Those aren't too broad or too narrow, but just right. Now, here's some examples from boxing. And I used artificial intelligence to help me come up with these. I tweaked them a little bit, but all right. So you don't want it to be too broad. For example, you could say boxing is a sport where people hit each other. Well, it's too broad because in MMA, people hit each other. In kickboxing, people hit each other. In fact, in football, people hit each other with their tackles and such, so it's just too broad. What about this one? Boxing is a sport where two men wearing red and blue gloves compete in a ring for 12 rounds trying to knock each other out. Well, that's too narrow because sometimes women box, sometimes the gloves are different colors. Bare knuckle boxing doesn't involve gloves whatsoever. You can have fewer than 12 rounds in an exhibition match. The goal isn't always to simply knock the other person out, it's to get possibly points in some cases to win a majority of the rounds. I boxed a little bit when I was younger. But here's a definition that seems to be just right. Boxing is a combat sport in which two competitors engage in a regulated contest using only their fists to score points or achieve a knockout. There could be some improvements on that, but it's a lot better than the first two. And it doesn't suffer those issues we pointed out with the first two. Now, Herrick provides several different types of definitions I'm not interested in you having to understand all those subcategories of definitions, but I do want you to understand these two, extensional and intentional. When it comes to extensional definitions, just think of definitions that use examples to help you understand the meaning. And when it comes to the intentional, those are the definitions that are actually articulated in the way that you might find in a dictionary. So, for example, extensional definitions use examples that clearly qualify, and you want to avoid outliers, cases that could be contested and possibly not qualify. Intensional definitions articulate the properties or attributes shared by all and only those objects in a term's extension, the necessary and sufficient conditions, for example. And you can see some good examples on page 64. And here's some guidance for articulating a good intensional definition. Make sure you convey the thing's essential properties. Ensure it's neither too narrow or too broad, but it's hitting that Goldilocks spot. Favor positive characterizations. And so it uses example of an aardvark in a computer. Check those out in the book, but you could have an exclusionary type definition that tells you what those things are not, but doesn't tell you a whole lot about what they actually are. Avoid vague, obscure, ambiguous, or figurative language. Avoid appeals to emotions and circularity, such as freedom means liberty. This adds a little clarity to our understanding of what freedom would actually mean. Now, here's some examples from exercise 3.7. You think about what's wrong with these definitions. God is a being that is not material, not limited, not visible. What's wrong with that as a definition of God? Well, it's a bunch of nots. Not this, not that, not the other thing. Doesn't give us anything positive to grapple with. You need to say something that's actually meaningful and helps us understand what God is or who God is. What about this one? A human being is a carnivorous animal. Is that a good definition for a human being? I wouldn't think so. For example, there are lots of other carnivorous animals. And I think we're actually omnivores, right? I had spaghetti for supper and it had meat in it, but also some pasta. What about this one? Time is an old gypsy man who never stops on his ceaseless trek through eternity. Well, it's very poetic, but it's very figurative as well. If you're looking for a precise definition of what time is, which philosophers attempt sometimes to articulate, it's not going to do. And what about peace means the absence of war? Maybe it's the case that in times of peace, there's not a war, but you need to say something more positive. That one's just too negative. A second question from Socrates, the second favorite question is, what's your evidence? What are your reasons, your premises, supporting conclusions you want to support? What's your why? Now, a reminder, an argument is a series of claims called premises intended to logically support another claim called the conclusion. Here's a quick note. On page 71, Herrick rules out intermediate conclusions, complex arguments where conclusions become premises to support another conclusion. He wants to say that in any argument, it only has one conclusion. I don't think there's any good reason to define arguments in this way. I think that's a too narrow of a definition. In fact, I can imagine, and I'm sure there are many, and I've heard of many and have written my own arguments, in which you'll have premises, these will lead to a conclusion, and now this conclusion pairs up with another premise, and those two together form another conclusion. And that conclusion perhaps could pair with the result of some other premises that led to a conclusion, both of which become premises and support the ultimate conclusion. Herrick wants to say that each of those is its own separate argument. I would just say that there are many arguments within a broader argument, and these conclusions are intermediate and then turn into premises. If that was confusing, that's the reason I put this here, because on page 71, he wants to make that exclusion, which I don't think is justified. And so no reason to adhere to that. I'm not going to test you on Herrick's exclusionary definition. Now, some things you need to look for when you're trying to identify what the argument actually is are premise indicators and conclusion indicators. So for example, if you see the word because, since, given that, due to the fact that, that's going to indicate that there's a premise somewhere nearby. Sometimes it's before, sometimes it's after. And the same thing with conclusion indicators, such as therefore, thus, hence, so, ergo is a really fancy one. Please don't put that in any of your work. Accordingly, consequently, therefore is the most common of thus. And in many cases, as you can see with my note right there, the premises and the conclusion, they aren't indicated by anything other than context. You just have to read the argument and ask yourself, what's the overall point that this passage is intending to logically support? And then what are the other claims that are intended to support it? And if you found the thing that the other things are supposed to support, that's the conclusion, and the other stuff would be the premises. So remember that whenever you're trying to identify an argument. So for example, here's one that's a little bit easier to follow from the book from page 73. Since all zombies, and there's a zombie cave, are mindless slaves, and because all mindless slaves lack free will, it follows necessarily that all zombies lack free will. Now, here you can see the indicator words. Since, that's a premise indicator. Since all zombies are mindless slaves, and because that's also a premise indicator. All mindless slaves lack free will. It follows necessarily that, which is a conclusion indicator. All zombies lack free will. Notice in this case, the conclusion comes at the end. The premises came first, but that's not always the case. You could simply say it follows, or you could just say all zombies lack free will because all zombies are mindless slaves and all mindless slaves lack free will. So you could rearrange things and you could use different indicators or no indicators at all. Here's that same argument simplified and formalized in a way where we can better examine it. Premise one, all zombies are mindless slaves. Premise two, all mindless slaves lack free will. Conclusion three, therefore, all zombies lack free will. Now you can see that I've diagrammed this argument with this Venn diagram, with these circles. And in this case, you can see each of these circles represents a category, and those categories have been bounded. So you can see that smallest circle there, it's up over here, is zombies, and it's within the category of mindless slaves. So all zombies would be within that zombie circle. And then they would also all be within the circle of mindless slaves. And you can see that all mindless slaves, which include things other than zombies, I suppose, if you're robots, would be within the broader category of things lacking free will. And so you can evaluate this argument visually by saying, well, all zombies are mindless slaves. That's represented with the zombies inside the mindless slaves. Okay. All mindless slaves lack free will. So I put the mindless slaves inside all the things lacking free will. Okay. Therefore, all zombies lack free will. Well, I guess so, because there's no way that a zombie could be outside of the bigger circle because it's within the smaller circle and it's trapped within all the things that lack free will. Here's another. All whales are mammals. No mammals, no mammal is a fish, therefore no whale is a fish. So all whales are mammals. So what we're going to do, we're going to draw the category whales. There it is. And it's all whales are mammals. So we put it inside the broader category of mammals. Here's whales, here's mammals. No mammal is a fish. So now we're going to have to distinguish mammals on one side and fish on the other. They're going to be exclusionary categories. And then the conclusion says, therefore, no whale is a fish. Well, I guess that's true because I can see from my diagram that the whales have to be excluded from the fish because they're within the category of mammals. And here's one more. Not one of Anne's pets is a dog. No dog is a reptile. Thus, not one of Anne's pets is a reptile. Now, this actually does not work. So let's visualize the first premise. So not one of Anne's pets is a dog. So you've got Anne's pets, and then over here you have dogs. And so you've got those excluded from one another. They're not overlapping whatsoever. There aren't any members of those categories that are in both. They're completely excluded. One's not inside the other. Next premise is no dog is a reptile. So all right, we've got the same thing. Reptiles and dogs are excluded from one another. But then the conclusion attempts to conclude that thus not one of Anne's pets is a reptile. However, the premises don't support that because nothing in the premises excludes reptiles from being one of Anne's pets. You could have very well have that overlap. Now, this doesn't mean that one of Anne's pets is necessarily a reptile. It just means this argument has not proven that not one of Anne's pets is a reptile. Okay, what you've just witnessed are some examples of deductive arguments that are either valid or invalid. And I want you to know up front that these terms, valid, invalid, strong, sound, these are technical terms used in a precise way in academic philosophy and critical thinking. So don't think that it just means an argument that gives us good reason to believe the conclusion. That's not what valid means in this context. That's not what sound means in this context. I understand that in the real world, people use the terms valid and sound to simply mean that's an argument that gives me good reason to believe the conclusion. That's not what it means here. You need to know the precise definition because we're not only going to deal with these types of arguments in this chapter, but in later chapters. And if you're taking a philosophy class, you know the difference. So deductive versus inductive arguments. Deductive arguments, and here you're not talking about deduction in the terms of Sherlock Holmes, because most of the things he figured out weren't deduction, but here deductive arguments are those that suggest certainty. And sometimes you'll hear the word must or all or necessarily. A lot of it, whether it's a deductive or inductive argument, has to do with the intent, and you can infer the intent from the author. Inductive, those are arguments that propose likelihood, but not complete certainty. So here you'll see words such as probably, it is likely, it's reasonable to conclude, that sort of thing. Now, within the category of deductive arguments, you have those that are invalid, valid, and if they're valid, they're either going to be sound or unsound. Okay, so these are subcategories only within deductive arguments. And these are the ones that are uh, looking for certainty, attempting to capture that certainty. So a valid deductive argument is one in which if the premises were true, the conclusion would have to be true. And I'm going to give you some alternative definitions, alternative ways, alternative wordings in just a second. A sound deductive argument is one in which the premises are true. So if it's valid, that means if the premises were true, the conclusion would have to be true. And if it's sound, that means it's a valid deductive argument with true premises, which would mean the conclusion has to be true. In the real world with real arguments, most are not deductive. Most are not valid. Most are not sound. So a lot of times we'll be dealing with some interesting philosophical questions, but with less applicability to the real world. So if this is a little bit confusing, don't worry too much. You need to know it, but we'll be more interested in those strong and weak arguments, which we'll get to in just a second. But as promised, here are some different ways to think of validity. These are all different definitions, ways to understand the same concept. A valid argument is one in which if the premises can't all be true without the conclusion also being true. An argument is valid if the truth of all its premises forces the conclusion to be true. That's an odd way to say it because, premises don't really force, but one way to understand it. I want you to capture it regardless of which of these actually sticks or resonates with you. An argument is valid if it would be inconsistent for all its premises to be true and its conclusion be false. It's got that logical connectivity where it would be inconsistent for that to be possible. An argument is valid if its conclusion follows with certainty from its premises, or an argument is valid if it has no counterexample. That is, a possible situation that makes all the premises true and the conclusion false. So if you're considering a valid argument, you can think of an example that proves that the premises could be true while the conclusion is also false at the same time. That means it's invalid. It's not valid. Okay. And remember, soundness means a valid argument with true premises. Whenever I took this years ago, I remember it being a little bit over my head, but it took a while. When you go through examples in the book, it'll stick soon, I promise. All right. Here are some arguments. Are they invalid or valid? And if valid, are they strong? So first of all, that argument we considered earlier. All whales are mammals. No mammal is a fish, therefore no whale is a fish. So all whales are mammals. You got whales inside mammals. No mammal is a fish, so those two categories are completely excluded. Therefore, no whale is a fish. Okay, that's valid. Now, is it sound? Now you have to go back and look at the premises. Are all whales mammals? I looked this up on the internet, and yes, to be a whale, you're a mammal. Is no mammal a fish? No. Fish breathe water, mammals do not, or they breathe oxygen, I guess, through the gills. So therefore, no whale is a fish. Well, this is a valid, sound argument. It really doesn't offer anything new. You probably knew no whale is a fish already, or you could look that up on Wikipedia or whatever. But there's a valid, sound, boring argument. Here's one that is not valid and sound. It's also boring, but not one of Anne's pets is a dog. No dog is a reptile, but that's not one of Anne's pets is a reptile. Well, we looked at it earlier and we could see the fact that there's nothing in the premises that prevents one of Anne's pets from being a reptile. So even though the author suggests that this should be deductive reasoning, they're proposing certainty, it's invalid because the premises would not push or force the conclusion to be true if they were true. So remember, you're thinking about this in the hypothetical. Before you even examine the truth value of the premises, you just ask yourself hypothetically, well, if the premises were true, would they force the conclusion to be true? In this case, no. And we could see that you could still have a pet of Anne's that's a reptile, even if not one of her pets is a dog, and even if no dog is a reptile, this does not exclude the possibility that one of Anne's pets is a reptile. So it's invalid. And last, here's an interesting one. All trucks are black. Matt owns a truck, therefore Matt's truck is necessarily black. What do you think about that one? Is that valid or invalid? Is it sound if it's valid? All trucks are black. Matt owns a truck. Think about how you might visualize this. Would those premises force the conclusion to be true? Is there any way that they could be true and the conclusion false? Well, it's a valid argument. If it were true that all trucks are black, we know that's not true, but if it were true that all trucks are black, and if Matt found a truck, then you would have to conclude that my truck is necessarily black. If we've established all trucks are black and that I own a truck, my truck has to be black. However, the argument is not sound. It is valid, it's not sound because are all trucks black? No. Some interesting things here. Premise 2 is true. I do own a truck. And conclusion 3 is also true. My truck is black. But even though the conclusion is true, this doesn't say anything at all about the logic of the argument. So notice that we're evaluating the logic, the internal force, the reason-based force of the argument itself. So you could have a conclusion that's completely true, and you could have an awful argument in support of it. Just because you have an awful argument doesn't mean the conclusion is necessarily false. It just means the argument's awful. And this is an awful argument because not all trucks are black. So you want to analyze that internal logic, but also the truth value of the premises when evaluating an argument. Okay, those are deductive arguments. Remember, special technical terms. Now, inductive arguments, are they strong or are they weak? These are those arguments that don't purport to prove anything, but they instead intend to give us good reason to believe something. So if it's a strong inductive argument, these are the most common types of arguments, the arguments you'll be most interested in as a regular human being. If it's strong, it provides adequate reason to believe the conclusion is likely true. And if it's weak, it doesn't do that. It doesn't provide enough reason to conclude the conclusion is likely true. And here are two of them. Ask yourself if these are strong. All right. Premise 1, I've enjoyed almost every Quentin Tarantino movie I've ever seen. Premise 2, True Romance is a movie written by Quentin Tarantino that I haven't seen. Therefore, I'll probably enjoy True Romance. What do you think? Is that a strong argument or a weak argument? And why? Well, it's a strong argument because in the first premise you have the key phrase, almost every. I've enjoyed almost every. It doesn't say I enjoyed one. It doesn't say I've enjoyed some. It says I've enjoyed almost every Quentin Tarantino movie I've seen. The second premise that this is a movie at least written by Quentin Tarantino gives us good reason to think that I would enjoy it because this is about me. And the conclusion, therefore, I'll probably enjoy the true romance seems to follow. Now, it doesn't guarantee that I would enjoy true romance. Maybe it's nothing at all like Pulp Fiction or Reservoir Dogs or any of those other awful films that are one of my guilty pleasures because they're not very morally admirable, but I still enjoy them. But I've got good reason to think that I will enjoy it. Now, most of the Quentin Tarantino films, if not all of them that I like, he also directed. He just wrote this true romance thing, but it's one that I've not watched. Perhaps I'll watch that soon. And this argument gives us good reason to think that I would enjoy it, but it's no guarantee. So it's inductive and it's strong. Second argument, many East Tennesseans are Vol fans. Matt is an East Tennessean, therefore Matt is a Vol fan. Is that strong or weak? And why? That's the most important thing here. Why? What are the key phrases? And I think I'm hearing you say it. Yep, that's right. Many East Tennesseans are Vol fans. It doesn't say all or almost all or even most. It just says many. And what the actual number is, I'm not sure. But many people don't care anything at all about sports. You might think if you're a fan, everybody else is too. But look around. It's not a majority of people that actually care about this sort of thing. Matt is an East Tennessean. Yes, I am. Therefore, Matt is a Vol fan. Just doesn't follow. It could be the case that I'm a Vol fan. It's got a better chance that I'm a Vol fan given those two premises than or given the first premise versus if I were from Wisconsin. If the first premise said many East Tennesseans are Vol fans, Matt is a Wisconsin, then it wouldn't follow at all. It'd be very weak. But here it's stronger than an argument where I'm a Wisconsin or a Wisconsinite, but it's still not strong for us to say, yes, this is a strong argument. All right. Herrick ends the chapter with some guidance on writing an argumentative essay. And he gives us 5 different steps. The first is state your thesis, which is the conclusion that you intend to support. Now, sometimes you won't know what the conclusion is. Depending on what the topic is, you may have some idea, but then once you get the rest of your ideas on the page, you may decide, oh, I actually think this. So I want you to skip ahead to step number 5, where you flesh everything out. That's also where you can revise what you originally thought. But the way Herrick presents it is that state your thesis or the conclusion you intend to support, then share the reasons that you have to support that. It would be sad if you started out, I think, this is the conclusion I'm going to support, and I'm going to come up with some reasons to rationalize it. Instead, I think it'd be a better idea to go out and do some research and think hard and then formulate what your conclusion is going to be, but we're following Herrick. He's smarter than I am. 3, articulate a reasonable objection. 4, sketch or reply to that objection. That I endorse big time, and that's standard in all philosophical contexts and all papers, published articles, philosophical books. You're going to need to proactively consider what a thoughtful person might say against what you've argued, and then proactively respond to that. Say, a smart, reasonable person might say, blah, 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 and don't make them out to be an idiot. Instead, think of a really good objection and then explain why that objection actually falls short. Now, if you ever do this and you come up with an objection that actually kills your argument, you shouldn't suppress that objection. Instead, you should revise your argument. You should just go ahead and say, well, okay, I thought this, but actually, I should argue this, and then come up with a new objection that you can take care of. And some closing guidance from Herrick. He also recommends and asks and requests, and so do I, that we practice the principles of charity and faithfulness. This means present the objection when you're writing that argumentative essay or that philosophical argument respectfully, accurately, in its best light. You don't want to set up an awful position that's obviously ridiculous. I know this is what happens in pop culture. I know this is what politicians do. This is what talking heads do. This is what influencers do. It's not what good philosophers do. It's not what you do as a junior philosopher. When discussing live with another human being or many human beings or on the internet or whatever, do the same. Listen thoughtfully or read the responses that you're being caught up in a pointless online debate. Make sure you read their responses thoughtfully and help your reasoning partner or partners make their best case. There's no reason at all to jump into most conversations and say, well, I'm 100% correct and they're 100% wrong. I'm going to show them what's wrong with their arguments. No, try to understand their perspective. Maybe together you can further your joint understanding because the shared goal is the truth. And we're all more likely to reach it when we work collaboratively together rather than competitively. All right, that's chapter 3. Soon we'll be moving on to chapter 4 on cognitive biases, all those different clouding things that can interrupt our better judgment.